Welcome everybody to our fourth plenary. So today we're going to be thinking about responsible research and innovation and considering what it means to be responsible, particularly in a time of great change. And we have 5 contributors today. You can see them all sitting around me. We have 2 people who have volunteered to make provocations for us about responsibility in research and engagement. And then we have 3 respondents who will form a panel to respond to those provocations. Now, just to be fair, the panel will only have they've only had a little tiny insight into what they might hear today. So they will be drawing on their expertise and their experiences to respond to the provocations, but, they will be having to think very quickly to do that. And also our speakers and our panel haven't been able to join us for the rest of the conference. So they're coming to this completely fresh and new. So just so that you know that they won't be drawing up on things that I've already discussed. So if there's things that you want to draw in from things you've heard already, please explain that when you ask your questions. So before we start, a few framing comments. Our plenary sessions have been, I think, quite challenging and in some places quite visionary. On Monday, we reflected together on how COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement have influenced our thinking, our practice, and our lives. On Tuesday, we explored with Dawn Ostwick from the Community Lottery Fund and Ottoline Lesser from UKRI what it means to be funders of a complex ecosystem. Ottoline was really interested in how do you make a system where people are front and centre. And Dawn was really interested on how do we need to move from our transactional ways of working to more relational ways of working. There was a lot of discussion and debate in the chat and Q&A about the dominance of the term science that was being used interchangeably with the word research, and a need to recognise the specific value of the arts and humanities as distinct and critical now and into the futures that we're navigating. We were reminded of the importance of listening to others, and that wonderful quote shared by Dawn, which I muffed up yesterday: "If you want me to know your name, you must learn my name first." Yesterday, we were inspired by Vidya to empower local ecosystems, creating long-term partnerships that are informed by communities' interests and needs. She highlighted that 85% of the community businesses in England were focused on reducing social isolation, and the effectiveness of these organisations in responding to the COVID-19 context, quickly mobilising support for local people. Richard Jones, who works for Manchester University, asked us to cast our eyes at inequality through a place-based lens, challenging us to reconsider the nature of institutions that could better relate to and be informed by communities of place. With inequalities of infrastructure, resources and research funding leading to a very fragmented UK, he asked us to consider that if 45% of the research funding is invested in London, Oxford and Cambridge, necessarily that couldn't be linked to the interests and needs of diverse communities of place across the UK. So today we're going to drill down into what responsibility, particularly in the light of COVID-19, looks like for research and innovation. Radhika Bynon has worked to address social inequalities throughout her career. Currently, she leads research at Guy's and St Thomas's charity. She will take us, I hope, Radhika, you will take us past the rhetoric, past the things that we already know, to explore how we actually can address social inequality in our work practices. Richard Owen is a researcher at Bristol University, and working in partnerships with colleagues such as Vivian Koo, he was one of the key architects of the notion of RRI, responsible research and innovation, and has embraced notions of responsible research and innovation into his work and practice. He will provoke us to ask questions about how our current context is opening up new futures and how to engage with that responsibly. Following our provocations, I will introduce you to our wonderful panel who will then respond to these talks, but I think we ought to get on. And Radhika, I'd like to welcome you to our virtual stage, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you and about all the practices that you've been involved in throughout your career. Radhika.
Hello. Well, this is how weird is this to be speaking at a conference, in when we're all sitting in our homes, in our bedrooms, in our lofts, in our kitchens. But hey, we've all got kind of used to that. But it's just worth acknowledging that these are extraordinary times, are they not? And my background is that I have, as Sophie said, I've spent my life working, really been trying to deliver change in communities, and trying in numerous ways, trying to say, how do you actually support the kind of change that we're all committed to, but it is so hard to see. And I feel like I've been at this for a long time, and it's all still rubbish. It's all still terribly unequal and awful. And what on earth have we all been doing? Anyway, but I presume that progress is, I know progress is being made, but sometimes it feels, this year particularly, it feels like I'm not sure, I think things had not progressed as much as I thought they had, to be honest. So for me, that's been a really deep reflection this year, just understanding that some of the changes that I thought that we had achieved as a culture, as a country, as a sector, actually were not so deeply won. My brief was to think, and I need to say that I'm a practitioner, so I'm really interested. I love research. I'm really interested in insight gathering. I want to know more and understand more, but I really want to put that to use. I want to go, so how is this going to help us to change things? So I'm very, so, I depend on all of you and your extraordinary expertise in giving us those insights, but I really want to take those insights and deliver them, into initiatives or things that communities and people can run with. And my brief was to think about reimagining research, innovation, engagement in the light of recent events. And I guess, it's stating the bleeding obvious to say that we have all learned so much this year, things that we did not expect to learn about ourselves, our neighborhoods, how we think, how we live, how we work. We've all learned so much. I can't process it all. And I think we've also learned so much about community, in our lives as well as in our work, about connection, community, about isolation, about loneliness, what loneliness feels like, and the different factors that can contribute to it. And for me, this year has also been an extraordinary kind of lived case study on the myriad ways in which poverty, inequality, racism intersect to impact our lives, our health, our very existence. And I think, the starkness of that has really struck me over the time. But it's also, it's given us so much opportunity to reflect and learn. And as I say, I think I'm beginning to realize that I think I'd been a bit complacent about the changes that we'd made. And I thought that we'd made more progress. And I live, and over the summer I was working in a community in East London, a community I've lived in for 30 years. My kids went to school here. I grew up around here. And been involved in lots of things. And one more in May, when the first data came out for COVID fatalities, our borough was the highest in the country. And I felt like that, like a punch in the stomach. What the hell have you been doing for all these years, all of you, if in the end, still, my neighborhood was the top of a horrible list, so I felt it quite viscerally, but also I thought, well, okay, so we need to, what do we learn from this? What are the steps forward? So it was hard, but also I think it really it was such a motivator for, right, okay, shoulder to the wheel, what do we need to do now? But also really learning, the values of the amazing assets that we have and how much people did. And yes, that was the most inspiring and wonderful thing of the year. I suppose none of us could have predicted in March that this extraordinary time would also lead to sort of a deep reflection on racism and the ways so many practices and institutions perpetuate white supremacy. And I don't think I would have even said that 6 months ago, 9 months ago. I just wouldn't, we are all, we're all swimming in the same water, and I'm swimming in the same water that we're all swimming in. And I have worked in organizations, as a woman of color, bringing that into the space. And, my early career did lots of work specifically around inequality, race inequality. But, I really I don't know, I think this year has opened up a conversation, and a rich conversation that I haven't been part of for a long time. So I'm really grateful for that, though so horribly one. And I know that we all share that. I recognize that all of us here value social research and the action that flows from it, and that all of us here recognize, you're in an engagement conference, we're all here because we know that research is strongest when it is people-centered, when it centers on and really kind of elevates the experiences of people who really understand the issue through their lived experience, through their very bones and their lives. And we all know that. And we know that kind of insight really, it transforms the work. It doesn't add something. It completely transforms the work when we get that in. And I recognize that we all share that commitment and that knowledge, understanding. But I also know that most research practice and the choices that emerge from research fail to live up to that expectation that, this is deeply, deeply community-led, community-owned, reflects the experiences of communities. That's what the work that I want to do. And I know we all want to do, but I also know that it's, I'm hands up, very hard to do. And that this isn't kind of simple, like you do it, it's sheep dip, it all works out. It doesn't. It's something we're learning, and I think I will acknowledge that it is not easy to do. And I've been part of things, and I think we've all been part of things where we looked at it and thought, hang on, did that really capture it? So I was looking, there's been some extraordinary, wonderful research that many of you have done, including the stuff that the Young Foundation, Emily, have done, which is around understanding COVID, the experience of communities during COVID. Some great, some really interesting insights, lots of ethnographic stuff, really, and I really appreciated that. One of the biggest ones I read was about communities. It had a survey of over 2,000 people, 100 plus interviews conducted between May and September, so over that summer period, and not in the whole report, not one mention of race, not one mention of the traumatic effect of the George Floyd murder. And I was living in a community, I am living in a community where that was a really traumatic event. And I think we all saw that, that people responded, it was such a hard thing those weeks, and watching that unbelievable murder, if you did watch it, and for so many Black people, the combination of watching that incident, the eruption of anger and protest that came from that, the realization that happened at the same time as we had the Public Health England report, which said people of color were at greater risk of COVID. So there was this kind of sense of, like it was, we, definitely in my community, and I'm sure all of us, we saw how people felt that as a crush, as a kind of absolute, it was very, very hard, painful, confusing, difficult. And yet the research on COVID, I don't know if it reflects it. And I'm, so at the charity that I'm at now, they had a Black-led team, and so there's a research by some community researchers working at the Social Innovation Partnership, where which is specifically aimed at people of color, and that does. But and no doubt there are others. I haven't read everything, so I don't want to, I'm not saying it. But I suppose I read that big one. 2,000 survey, 100 interviews, not one mention. National survey, not one mention. So what was that? Was it that there were no Black people talked to? I don't think so. I think it will have been that the researcher went in with a set of questions. The researcher looked white, and the people gave them the answers that they were asked. So, it wasn't like it was a deliberate thing. It's just like, how could that have happened? So tools and things, so finishing off. So what I want to say is, I think that there are things we can do. And there are, we have got to get better at this. I have got to get better at this. We've all got to get better at this. So the first thing I would say is we need to change the team. We need to change the team. We need to do intentional recruitment. And I'm going to say this, not just one person. Because that one person will conform and do what the organization needs. She will be the person that fits into that organization. So we need to recruit two, at least two, so that they can be a team together and they can bounce off each other, and then find ways of pushing back and challenging the organization, the institution that they're working with. So recruit intentionally. We can't keep having the teams we've got now. I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time, and yet the majority of our teams are still look in a particular way. The other thing I would say is that so often the work, the input that communities bring is about insight gathering, and who decides what the questions are. I think, community people of color, Black people, working class people, the community come in and help us to gather insight. How are they shaping what the questions are? And I know, Emily, that's some of the work that the Young Foundation has been really trying to do, and lots of organizations trying to do, but that's the hard work, isn't it? How do we change the questions? How do we shape how do we open ourselves up to thinking that actually the priorities of communities might be very different to the ones that we're thinking about, and really kind of how do we shift the questions and the topics? And I know these things are determined by clients, by research bodies. We're not always in control. We can't always choose, but it's like, how do we push that? And then, and how do we take that co-production, co-design thing to a much deeper level? And then finally, I think if I was going to say there's one thing, well, I said one thing I would say is recruit. The other thing I would say is build relationships with people who can give you these insights. Don't just go in and extract. I know that's not how, I think we all know that, but so often what we do feels extractive, but it's got to be about deep relationships. Find organizations, groups, and invest in them. Invest your time, invest your intellectual capacity, invest in understanding them, because it is only through that deep relationship of trust that you will hear things that will challenge you and give you the amazing insights that will transform our work. I'm going to stop there because I've used up my 10 minutes.
That's wonderful, Radhika. Thank you so much. And I think picking up some of the themes that we have been thinking about in the conference about what does it mean to do relational practice and the time that you need to invest in building those partnerships. So I'm going to hand over to Richard now. Richard, if you'd like to come and take the stage, or the virtual stage.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and share my screen, my PowerPoint. I am going to talk to Sophie about the future and about how taking responsibility for it, but I thought I'd start with the past, actually. And hello everybody. What I'd like all of you to do is start by asking that you imagine that you're standing in this large grey muddy field or something a bit like it. This one's very near our house. And you're wearing a smock, and all your clothes smell of wood smoke. And the reason is that the year is 1422 and you're a medieval peasant and you're about to spend the day picking rocks from this field one by one. And your life as a medieval peasant, I'm afraid to tell you, is going to be short, brutal and hard. But on the plus side, you've got great teeth because sugar was yet to arrive on our shores. And every Sunday you're going to trudge across that field to church. And now I'd like you to imagine that you're entering that church and you're taking your seat in the pews and you're going to look up and this is what you're going to see. Now, this is what was called the Doom. It's a wall painting of the Last Judgment. And there were lots and lots of these in medieval churches across England and Wales, prominently placed above the chancel arch for all to see, including yourself. Most was destroyed in the Reformation. This particular one is called the Ladder of Salvation, and it's telling you that you have three possible futures. If you live a pious, good life, as of course I am, you will be admitted by St. Peter to heaven. There's St. Peter at the sort of top right. You can see him admitting all the pious souls to heaven. If you have transgressed badly, you're going to be thrown in the bottom left into the fires of hell, which I guess for those of you in the snowy parts of Britain, you might like a little bit of that warmth. Many of us who've sort of transgressed a little bit, purgatory awaits. And that's the bottom right, walking backwards and forwards on those pins until the last trump is sounded, when we will rise from our temporary graves to have our souls weighed for our final destination, salvation or damnation. And the future was written for you 3 visions of the future visions that were intended to warn you and shape your actions and behavior in the present, so that they were constitutive. And of course, that suited some, particularly the clergy and the nobility, very well. So it's tempting to suggest here in the 21st century that we have many more possible futures than those of a medieval peasant. And certainly life for many, but not all, isn't as short or as hard or as brutal. But still, I think for many the future can feel as if it is already written, plus or minus a few sentences here and there. How many of us feel trapped in our jobs or lack of jobs, or relationships or lack of relationships, or the endless ennui of the present? How many of us are just sort of trying to survive? And how many of us are standing at the edge of our own muddy field, like Vladimir and Estragon or Kerry and Curtin, waiting for the future that never starts and never will, picking up rocks again and again? I mean, what can change that? And the thing is, crises change things. Crises can unwrite the future, and we're in one of those moments right now. They create new horizons, both good and bad, of possibility and moments for agency. They create important wriggle room for a different future. From the Black Death in the medieval period and the end of feudalism to Chernobyl and the end of communism, crises change things. The pieces are kind of thrown up in the air and they don't necessarily fall back in the same place. And I'm really intrigued about why that happens. And it turns out that the change starts with challenges to legitimacy. And what I mean by legitimacy is the extent to which there's cultural and societal support for the way things are done, sort of norms and of society. You know, during crises, people ask questions. Gosh, we've been asking lots of questions in the last 6 months, and we will continue to do so going forward. 9/11 was an example. After 9/11, the way terrorism had been combated came under widespread challenge. And the response was interesting because what we saw was unprecedented collaboration between the state, big tech, and intelligence agencies in the name of Homeland Security and the discourse of the war on terror. New discourses emerge after crises. The wiggle room is created for that to happen. What happens next? Well, entrepreneurs step in. People with ideas, people who seize opportunities. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, the Thénardiers. In the fog of crisis, they imagine new futures for themselves and for others, for us. And their future visions, think about this, their future visions populate the present of those who've yet to live. And those visions are constitutive. And what goes hand in hand with entrepreneurship is innovation. And often we think about innovation as creating new products and processes, and it does do that, of course it does. But I think of innovation as fundamentally creating futures in sometimes profound and disruptive ways. And it is that combination of entrepreneurship and innovation in the wake of a name of crises that has such profound potential to shape the futures of people yet to be born and ourselves in our later years. I mean, just think about it. Facebook, Google, Instagram, Snapchat, smart cities, Internet of Things, Cambridge Analytica, platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism, Uber, psychographic marketing, Zoom. Things we didn't know 20 years ago, but now are an integral part of our present. Visions of people who lived in the past, not that long ago, their future visions are now a fundamental part of our present. Machines that know more about us than we can ever know ourselves. Machines that learn to predict our futures and which aim for those futures to be as predictable, controllable, and commodifiable as that of a medieval peasant. And that suits some very, very well. And I think, Radhika, you had it when you said, who gets to ask the question? Who gets to write the future? Who is writing the future now? Because I think this is just such an important moment. This is a crisis as profound as any in modern history. And I think, Radhika, you're right. It's a combination of crises. It's a combination of crises that have happened because of a virus, but the virus has uncovered that have been with us for many, many years. And crises of this magnitude are going to bring entrepreneurship and innovation on quite probably an equally seismic scale. So I think we need to be alert and aware and look out for it. Who are the entrepreneurs who are stepping forward, and what innovations are being created in startups, in incubators, in engine sheds, in digital hubs and corridors, in our universities? So I'm just going to leave with these questions. What futures are being created in the wake of COVID and in the name of COVID? And for all of us here today, how can we better open up those futures and engage society with those futures in the making? And fundamentally, what does that mean for engagement professionals who have an incredible skill for opening up those futures and enabling us to collectively write that future together and take responsibility for it? And I think that could mean a role for engagement professionals that, yes, is about communication, it's about deliberation, it's about engagement, but that could be aimed at enabling a new mode of participatory action in which the main aim is to enable us to co-author a future that is equitable, just, sustainable, and flourishing. And I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. That was a very thought-provoking provocation. So in true engaged style, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a couple of minutes to reflect. So we've heard from Radhika and her challenge about 3 things we can do. We can change the team. We can work out how we can include a wider diversity of perspectives and who deciding who the questions are, or as Richard framed it, who decides who the future is, who's writing that future. And Radhika saying we need to build relationships with people who can provide those insights and invest in those long term. And Richard asking us, well, what kinds of futures are being created? And how can we open up those futures and deciding those futures to a wider cohort of people? And what role do we, for those of us who are engagement professionals, what role do we have in doing that? So I'm going to give you, listen up, Jane, I'm going to give everybody 2 minutes, and then I'm going to introduce our panel who will be reflecting on what they've heard, drawing from their own perspectives. And if you want to share questions or you want to make reflections in the chat, you've got a bit of time to do that now without needing to listen. So I'm hoping that will give you a bit of reflection time. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Okay, so I hope that was helpful for you, having a couple of minutes break. We're facing some real challenges around what does it mean for our practice to develop responsible research and innovation. And so we invited 3 panelists to reflect on what Radhika and Richard have said, but also to draw in their own perspectives and experiences of what it means to do responsible research. And delighted to see some questions coming up. Brilliant, thank you. But I'm going to turn to our panelists first. And first up is Jane Furs, who works at Warwick University.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jane Furs from the University of Warwick. As Sophie sort of alluded to, I have an incredibly long title, but I'm on the professional services side of the university, and I span marketing, communications, regional strategy and community engagement, and also the broader, what I would call the broader public engagement and civic engagement through agenda, through a newly created Warwick Institute of Engagement, which I co-direct with one of my academic colleagues. So firstly, thank you very much to Radhika and Richard for, I don't know whether I should be saying thank you actually, but for the challenges which have been passed in our direction, but I'm delighted to respond to them. So I'll take one of Radhika's points first, because I don't think I actually couldn't agree more with one of the points that she made. So I don't come at this from so much from a research point of view, but from an engagement perspective, from the community engagement perspective. And one of the things that I think is very simple to say, but is so important not to lose sight of, is at the heart that responsible research depends on responsible engagement, and at the heart of responsible engagement lies relationships. And actually we know that relationships are complex, and I think that's one of the things that I just couldn't emphasize more, is that when we're engaging as universities or institutions, we need to think about whether we're engaging in an authentic and consistent way across the institution. Now, I point that out because universities are big, complex places, but actually the member of the community or the public or whoever we're engaging with isn't and shouldn't have to make that distinction. So what they consider is that they're engaging with the university. So that's one challenge I would throw out to our sector is how consistent are we with that engagement and with the people we're engaging with. I'm sure I'm echoing one of the themes that has come out from other sessions, but we can't and shouldn't parachute in and leave again. This is about, if we're not going to commit long term and to sustainable relationships, then I don't believe we should be starting them. And that's one of the key points that I hold on to and have championed at Warwick. It's about relationships. They take time. Radhika made this point, but let's not run away from the fact that that takes investment. It takes skills and it takes time. And people obviously in the institution need to do that and be able to commit to it. And then the other points I kind of really echo and I think can support what Radhika was saying is it's about a mutual agenda or even thinking the other way is what is this community's agenda? What are their priorities? What are their needs? And again, I know we know that, but I think we always need to keep checking back to, is this a mutually created agenda rather than an agenda that I'm kind of walking in with and expecting people to join in with. And the other one, again, these are very basic points, but that's why I pull people back to relationships, is do what you say you're going to do. Just not false promises, because that's, again, these things are important in relationships. So that's sort of one area of response, which I'd almost just put relationships right in the think relationship. Don't think community. Don't think people out there. Just, this is a relationship that I'm nurturing and I'm building, and it's one that needs to have trust in it, because otherwise nothing good will come of it. And then the second one is a broader point, is I'm also I'm a very strong advocate for place-based engagement. You can tell that from me talking about community engagement. But if we really do want to make a difference as universities, I believe that place is where we can make the greatest difference, or the sort of greatest impact. And that, to me, it's kind of a fairly simple view, but I think what we can do is build, if we do this the right way, is actually build a deep understanding of that place and its local needs and the needs of communities. And that, to me, is what drives that sort of responsible agenda and the ability to respond to needs and have an impact. I think we can have an agenda where we're looking for and aligning on tangible outcomes for all. And I think you can do that with a place-based agenda. And also, I think what we can do to reflect on one of Richard's points is actually build a really powerful community of place. And actually, I think that is actually recognising that to deliver tangible outcomes for people, for individuals or communities, takes a broad range of stakeholders working together and aligning and joining up. And that's why I'm so interested in communities of place, whether that be the key policy makers or decision makers in that region, or whether that be voluntary organisations or the people in a community. The join up there, to me, is really important, and that's where impact can come. And actually, I would challenge, in terms of research, the research agenda and community engagement and responsible engagement, I think often it's about joining up the dots between community, people, individuals, research, policy and decision making that will make a difference as well. And the last point I'd make on placemaking is, as a university, and I apologise for the phrase, but I think it's important that you're engaging in something where you have skin in the game. Because actually it gives you credibility. You are of that place, and if the place thrives and communities thrive, then so should you. So I think those are my sort of challenges back, and some of my reflections back on how we might want to think as a sector. I can give a couple of examples, Sophie, if that's helpful and I have time.
You've probably got about a minute, so if you can summarise them quickly, I'd be really grateful.
Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll give a couple of sort of COVID-related examples where I can see a change, which was a positive change. Is we have built over a period of 3 years, built very strong relationships with one of our local communities, the neighbouring community to our campus, but also our regional decision makers and stakeholders. I would say, and I think this is something that I personally think we did well as a university. We made a very, very active decision along with our stakeholders that we would, we ourselves were facing a crisis during COVID, but that we would not withdraw, that we would be even more visible. So we stepped forward, not back. And actually, we didn't get too hung up about what we did. We did the right thing. We asked people what they needed. And actually we galvanised across the university to provide volunteers across the city. A lot of that support was on immediate needs around loneliness and isolation, but also food poverty. So we ran through our network of volunteers, we actually enabled a lot of the food banks to run across the city and used our estate vans for driving around. I'm only giving those examples because actually that was an immediate response, institutional response to something that was a crisis and a need at that time. And actually what that has done is also accelerated the relationships we have across our other anchor institutions. So again, it's a different way of thinking. It's about engagement. I wasn't really thinking about research. I was thinking, what does this community need and what resources do I have to support it?
Brilliant.
I could say so much more, but I will shut up.
I know we will. You'll have more chance in the discussion, and I think it's something that we've been looking at a lot. That if you're trying to build long-term, trusting relationships around research, if you're then in a position where we are facing a pandemic, that actually you can't then just forget the partners. You need to look and say, well, how can we work together to face this together rather than withdrawing? So I think a lot of universities really struggling with that. How do you maintain those relationships in these current times? Right, well, next up to respond is Emily Morrison. She leads the Institute for Community Research at the Young Foundation. So without more ado, Emily, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Sophie, and good morning, everybody. And what an energising and thought-provoking discussion. I'm so glad we had 2 minutes for reflection, because I think I'm going to need about sort of 200 minutes more at the end of the panel as well. But as Sophie said, I lead the Institute for Community Studies. We're a research institute that's independent, and our whole programme of work is driven from a co-created research agenda, which puts community voice at the heart. So we don't start to research anything unless it is a priority for communities. And that really has been an attempt, and we're still learning, I think it's fair to say, and we can always do better, to shift this sense of who is asking the questions, who is setting the agenda for place-based research, but also on some of the most crucial issues, such as inequality, such as social cohesion, such as the notions of poverty and welfare, and who is asking the questions and trying to really change that power dynamic so that it is communities at the fore. I had a couple of slightly different reflections, and some of these really linked to the shifts that I think we've seen in the last really complicated year. And one of those is about, I think we're really at a point where the need for different methods, and methods that are particularly sensitive to community voice and to dialogue and to inspiring different ways in which communities want to engage, and listening to them about what those look like, rather than using the same paradigms that we perhaps have all in our different ways kind of clung to over the years. This is now even more important. And the reason for that is that actually there has been a real lack of using participatory and dialogic methods to understand communities' experience during the pandemic. Some of this has naturally been because of social distancing, because of the restrictions, and because we've all been trying to work out how do we still do meaningful community engagement safely, and in a way that means that we're not compromising people safely. But it does mean that we've just finished a huge review into how COVID has affected communities at the Institute, and finding really good, robust dialogic research with communities to add to that piece is very, very, it's a huge missing gap. And what this means is that our understanding of how conditions and such as inequality or poverty have changed at local level is currently quite weak and lacking in certain areas. And that really is an area where good, responsible research with communities needs to play a really significant role as we start to look at what some people are calling recovery, what others are calling reset. And that's partly just to avoid some of the huge risks and the huge absences of issues such as what Radhika was talking about in terms of the impact of Black Lives Matter, the trauma that BAME communities have gone through, also the trauma of the extremely poor communities, those with no recourse to public funds, for example, because, and it was interesting, I was in a workshop yesterday with a lot of different research teams and academics looking at the social implications of COVID on communities. The statistics will tell you, with a statistical picture, and somebody was actually saying this, that the most poor in society have not experienced the greatest change to their lives due to COVID. But that is just a statistical picture, and all of us working with communities and deeply in communities know that masks an enormous set of challenges and huge trauma and an increase in precariousness of people's lives, an increase in mental health and well-being concerns, an increase in how they have experienced discrimination and difference in their experience of the pandemic. And we can only access that through using lived experience methods, dialogue, participation, and through listening to communities, deep listening about how they want to engage and how they feel able to engage. So I think there is a really strong point here about the methods that we need to be using and the importance of engaging in a way that communities feel ready to engage at this moment in time. The other importance, I think, in terms of the use of dialogic methods and community voice is also to make space for and capitalize on the increase in agency that people have felt within their communities in certain areas, not all areas, of course, because there's differences in the resources people have available, and we must also be mindful of that. But there's emerging research that now 47% of people now feel they can create change in their communities. Before the pandemic, that was only at 29%. So even though that isn't the majority, that's a huge increase. And if we do not find new methods to engage people, we're not going to make the most of those that have started to initiate their own change, that have found a role in communities. And it's important that we meet them where they are at the hyperlocal level, and that we understand how we can support them. And that's important both from a sense of responsible research and decision making, but it's also because of the sense of social cohesion. This is important on another level, in that we need to find ways of recognizing and supporting communities that are seeking to bridge some of the divides and are seeking to also further these agendas, that if they are not responded to and resourced properly, such as sort of the structural discrimination happening in our communities, if we don't respond to that where people have found agency, then it will create more risks. And we have a duty, a moral duty and a responsibility to support people in that way where they have found new agency. And there's also very encouraging statistics about how people's sense of strength of belonging to a community has also increased. So we've got some very interesting dynamics happening here in terms of agency, which are also meaningful to research. And then the third point that I wanted to make was really about the need for specificity and also for accessibility in terms of where we're working. If we've seen one thing or learnt one thing from the last sort of 10, 11 months, nearly a year now, I can't believe it's nearly a year, it's that we have shifted very much to the hyperlocal. And a lot of people were working here before, but hyperlocal in terms of differences of experience of the pandemic, different neighbourhoods, their resources, their capacity, different levels of deprivation, different levels of agency. And we need to be able to find ways of researching that recognise the hyperlocal, and we need to find ways of intervening with communities or led by communities that respect the hyperlocal. And for all of us working in engagement, because I always want to be practical, that shouldn't stall our efforts, but it does mean that we need to think about who is in the consortium when we work at local level, and how can we intervene in some of our rather antiquated and sometimes, obstacle creating research systems. So who could be a co-I? Why does that have to be an academic? It shouldn't always be an academic. It should be somebody that knows that community, that knows the hyper-local landscape, who can direct research or choose research, and who can actually drive and lead research. That needs looking at so that we can actually work more effectively at the hyper-local level. And that is more important in terms of the next really complicated landscape that we face next year, where we have a resource stripped landscape. People's budgets are really exhausted. A lot of us are really exhausted, and communities in a lot of ways are also definitely exhausted. And so as a result, we need to join up, and we need to really think about finding the right people who know those communities, who we can empower and put resources with, so that we can be more effective with the little resource that we have, and also so that we don't continually displace and duplicate and challenge each other's efforts. This is a real time for maximising collaboration. And then the final point I want to make, because I don't want to go over time, is really about there's been a real absence that has been picked up by the community listening groups that we've been doing over the last month, in terms of actually engaging communities in how the pandemic is managed. And obviously at the beginning, we had an acute, unprecedented crisis, a public health risk. We didn't know much about the virus. So of course, there had to be top-down restrictions. But a lot of communities are now questioning, where is the engagement in how we manage the next steps? Where is the engagement? Where was that moment of engagement after the first lockdown? That was missing. And would that have built better trust? And could people working locally with communities, and with local authorities and local councils and universities, how do we actually listen to how people want to manage the next really complicated pattern? Because that lack of engagement, my academic life research is democracy, so I'm very interested in what it does to democracy. But on a very practical human level, people are questioning, why have we not been involved? Could tier systems, have been managed better? So that's the final point. Thank you for the time out there, Sophie, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Oh no, it was great to hear your reflections, Emily, and some really both challenging and thoughtful reflections. And we will come back to you. I was sorry to be waving at you, but I want to make sure we've got enough space for Viv to share some of her reflections. So without more ado, I shall rush over to Viv, and Viv, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. So my name's Viv Koo. I'm a lecturer in responsible innovation at the University of Bristol. But I wanted to say that a year ago at the last Engage, I was there as a public engagement professional in the inspiredly named workshop, The Only Way is Ethics, which I still really enjoy. It wasn't my name. And there's a few things I think I want to reflect on today, but at the end, I'm going to come back to what all of this means for public engagement professionals, because I think I can see that coming through in the comments in terms of the things that people want to kind of hear about. To start off with, I wanted to reflect on Radhika's almost her first comment, which was about being a practitioner, about kind of looking at what can the knowledge produced through research actually do. And that's something I've carried with myself throughout my career. I started off in philosophy, and it was life-changing and amazing for me on a personal level, but I ended up really frustrated by how inward-looking academic philosophy was, and how most of the philosophers that I spoke to weren't particularly interested in what it actually meant in the world. And so I kind of set off into the world to find out what I could apply this knowledge to, and I've ended up in responsible innovation. I really, really share Radhika's message that research is strongest when it's centered around people. And I think for Richard and I in the work that we do with researchers in responsible innovation, essentially that's kind of what we're trying to move researchers towards, is looking at their research and in terms of kind of what it does to people and how people can kind of have an input. This is really, really well practiced in the kind of realms of social research, but in kind of science and engineering, it's really still at a very, very early stage. This is not a common way of working, and responsible innovation is partly about kind of bringing voices into how research works. So yeah, so an example of that is a researcher in one of our cohorts that we work with. So just as a kind of, Richard said that I'm going to kind of do the practical bits of what responsible innovation is. So in 2018, EPSRC mandated for the first time that every PhD student that they fund, so every engineering PhD student should receive training in responsible innovation. And they produced something back in 2013 called the Area Framework, which sets out what they think responsible innovation should be. So they think that researchers acting responsibly should anticipate the future that their research could create. They should be reflective. They should think about who they are, what motivates them, what they know and don't know, what they can't even possibly hope to know, and how all of that impacts on the process and products of their research. That they should engage, so they should open up this process of reflection and envisioning of the futures in an inclusive way, and that they should bring all of that knowledge to act upon the way that they do their research. And essentially what this kind of mandate that they set out in their latest call for centres for doctoral training has done is that it set off a grand experiment across the country. So in research centres and institutions across the country, people are trying to work out what responsible innovation actually means, what it would look like in practice and what it means to teach it. And I've got a little example from one of the cohorts that we worked with last year. So these are aerosol scientists. I don't know about you, but I've suddenly seen aerosol science all over the news this year. It's suddenly a big thing because of COVID. I didn't really know what it was before teaching aerosol scientists. But one of the students last year, Pete, is doing some research into the way that aerosols impact on indoor air pollution. And he wrote a little bit on responsible innovation for his research plan. He wanted to go out and tell people, he was talking about engagement, he wanted to go out and tell people what they needed to do to fix indoor air pollution. And I came back to him and I said, I think there's possibly more to this. I think perhaps you need to understand what people are doing and what impacts on their choices that might contribute to indoor air pollution. You know, there's a bigger picture here other than your kind of view as a scientist on what they should or shouldn't do. And so I linked him up, he's now at Imperial, I linked him up with Imperial's White City place-based engagement practitioners who are now doing workshops with their local community, building indoor air sensors and discussing kind of what impacts on indoor air pollution in their communities. So that's kind of that bit. I also wanted to come back to Radhika's point on changing the team, because I think that's so important. I see firsthand in the work that I do with researchers, not only the impacts that kind of lack of diversity in researcher cohorts has on the things that they produce in the world, but also actually on their capacity to even conceive of potential negative impacts. So I think kind of diversity of the teams who are doing research has a really strong impact on even how the research happens, not just what it produces. And I think there are kind of longer term answers in terms of, I feel like I'm constantly talking about pipelines and how we get kind of more diverse voices into research. But I think there are also questions about what we need to do right now in terms of the research cohorts that we have right now. And I think the answer lies in precisely the kind of long-term relationships with communities that both Radhika and Emily and Jane have all been talking about. And the final thing I wanted to reflect on, have I got time, Sophie? How am I doing for time? I'm good. Okay, is coming back to kind of Richard's description of the wave of innovation and entrepreneurship that's going to be coming as a result of this crisis that we're living through. And this is a bit of a call to action, to be honest, because I think that actually public engagement practitioners can be part of that wave of innovation. And I want them to be part of that wave of innovation. And specifically, this is kind of looking at what Richard's talking about in terms of responsible innovation being about imagining futures. We have so many incredible skills and engagement, and we've got so many kind of examples of really great ways of thinking about the future, but we need a real step change in our ability to imagine futures with communities in an inclusive way. And I feel like for me as a practitioner and a researcher, that's what I'm going to be doing right now. And it's a kind of, for me, it's a call out to all my practitioner colleagues to kind of start innovating, to kind of take this moment to be innovators, to innovate new ways to think about the future with and for communities.
Brilliant. Thank you, Viv. And thank you to all of our panelists for having to respond to some quite provoking content from Radhika and Richard. I'm going to give us another 2 minutes to reflect, and then I'm going to come back to the panel. So the most popular question was one asked by Shawnee Sanderson, and they ask, how can we hope to meaningfully engage and listen to our communities under the current restraints of research, funding and culture? Relationship building is time limited by grants, with researchers entering into relationships often led by their own agenda. And I'm going to come first to Radhika and then to Emily, and then I'll come to Richard, if that's all right. Sorry, Radhika, to come to you first with no warning, but you seem to be quite good at spontaneously thinking and speaking at the same time.
Thank you, Sophie. I don't know if I am, but I suppose for me, this question about meaningfully engaging and listening, because I come from a culture where I think we're going from project to project, which is the nature of work, or for all of us. That trying to draw connections across those projects. So really, I suppose I have found it really valuable to build relationships and to form partnerships with organizations, groups, institutions, and then develop my work in relation to that. So rather than saying this call, I'm going to go for that, and that's with this group, and this call, I'm going to go for that, and that's with that group, thinking much more of my work as I do this with this group. What do we want to do together? And so absolutely, these, if there were simple answers, we'd have all cracked this, wouldn't it? This is hard, but I really do think that if we forefront the partnership, if we forefront the people that we are working with, and then develop our priorities and our work in relation with that enables us. I mean, that has over time enabled me to work with some groups over time. I don't know if that answers it, or if anybody else can add more useful response.
I think it's a really helpful response, Radhika, and I think it goes to those two levels of university. If Jane was reflecting on, we can develop these university relationships, and then they can come into play around our, the shared research agendas. Whereas actually, often we're making those relationships at a research level, and therefore there isn't that long-term sustained relationship. So I think that's a real tension. Emily, I don't know if you have any words you'd like to say in response to that question.
Yes, of course, and I completely agree with Radhika on the relationships front, and I think and the partnership. I think if I just think about the kind of systems that we have to deal with, just to add a different view, I think we are still lacking that the infrastructure, and I don't know if that is a network or if that is something that would provide greater recognition of the need to start our research inquiries, our engagement activity, even our innovation activity and our teaching from the perspective of what is meaningful to the local places that we are part of. We are lacking infrastructure that goes beyond project to project, other than, as Radhika's just demonstrated, the considerable commitment of different individuals on whom we place huge burdens, to be those connecting points, and they do a wonderful job. But I think there's still a space for infrastructure that is sensitive to, communities, that doesn't overburden them, but also that shows our commitment on a more sustained scale, rather than we just dip in when we need to engage and then we dip out. So I don't have the golden chicken for what that looks like, but I definitely recognize the problem. And I think the only other thing I wanted to add is, increasingly we need funding models, and we need the freedom to initiate partnership models that can really recognize and support community-led responses. And led is really important. It's not engagement necessarily. It's allowing them to lead, and it's saying that if you can just make space and you can distribute your resource and you can hand over the resource, then actually you will get more interesting, innovative forms of tackling these challenges. And you will get more interesting, innovative questions and research inquiries, but you just have to create the space and you have to hand over the space.
Great, thanks, Emily. And Richard, have you got any final comments on this question? And then Viv and Jane, if you can see the Q&A, I'm coming to Erin's question next. I'm coming to you first. But Richard, a final reflection on this question, please.
It's a really great question. Maybe I can just be a little bit provocative, which is I agree with everything that's been said, and creating long-term relationships and collaboration is really good for those that are willing to get involved. But I also see our role as creating places for contestation and outright conflict, actually. And it's important that we create those opportunities for people to have that level of contestation and not feel that they can't do that.
Brilliant, great, a great provocation to end that reflection. So I'm coming to you next, Jane. Erin says, it seems to me like there are two different timelines at play. So the longer time that we've just been talking about to sustain these relationships, and a shorter, more urgent timeline of responding to something like COVID. How can we balance the two to be effective at dealing with sudden, unpredictable change and also be sustained and embedded? And do you have any ideas of practices, guidelines, or ethos do we need to embrace or make this possible? And I think, Jane, from your talk earlier, I think you'll have reflections on that. And then Viv, I'm going to ask you for your response from a research-based lens, if that's all right.
So I agree with I sort of agree with the point about two different timelines and the ability to sort of to work long term, but also respond. But I'd kind of still go back to my point is and I hope this isn't unhelpful, but actually it's the building of those long-term relationships which actually allows you to respond in the short term. So and I'm sorry that there isn't a simple answer to that, and there isn't a quick fix, but I think that's probably my kind of broad answer. Going forward, what I think I've learned from COVID and I think will help a little bit with answering this question is actually looking to those, to Emily's point, is actually looking to those communities, whether it's community leaders or the voluntary sector who haven't been mentioned particularly so far, who have rightly gained a lot of agency through the crisis. And actually, I think it's about thinking about building that broader network of relationships, which actually can then help with the short term, if that makes sense, because they have already built those relationships. So I think the message is, let's not just think us, let's think about what those broad communities of practice look like, and actually think about those people who do have long-term sustainable relationships, where it may be easier and more effective for us to act in the short term. So a little bit of a mixed answer, but I'd still hold by it's right for us to build those long-term relationships, but look to others in the short term who may hold that relationship better than you do. And in terms of practices, I just wanted to come to one which is this is, I'm afraid, is long-term, but one of the things that we are interested in doing, it's a big ambition, but I'm up for it, and I'm ever optimistic, is doing in Coventry in particular, is working as a group, again as a sort of community, including all of the key anchor institutions, with the ambition of actually putting community engagement, but consistent engagement across the city at the heart of what we do. Now that's quite a big ask, because actually we're asking a number of big institutions to come together to work on what the model for engagement looks like and best practice looks like. But I think it will work. I think it's probably the big route forward, the big breakthrough that we need. And actually, the crisis has been a catalyst for that, which I'd support. Sorry, it's a long answer. Lots of things in there. Lots of things in there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It was packed full of stuff, so that's fine. And Viv, over to you.
I absolutely support everything that Jane's just said, particularly with regards to voluntary sector and community-based organisations. So particularly in my work previously as an engagement practitioner, one of the things that I quickly realised, so I came to engagement relatively late. I realised I'd actually been doing engagement for years, but it wasn't called that. I was working in the arts sector. But one of the things I quite quickly realised was that there was no sense for us as engagement practitioners in terms of trying to set up completely new kind of relationships with communities when there are already organisations and communities that have those relationships, that have relationships of trust. So it was more, for us, it turned more into a matter of kind of working with those community organisations and repeatedly coming back to them with different kind of ways of engaging with the research that was going on in the university. And I agree that I think that's the way to shore yourself up against crises, is to have those long-term relationships, is to already be knitted into those communities so that you have a way of saying, how can we support you, community organisation, to support your community? What do you need from us? And I also kind of want to reflect on what a strange and remarkable time this is to be kind of thinking long term, because, you know, there are these ideas often when we think about kind of predictions of the future, we're talking about, we often talk about how they need to be plausible. But I think now is a really interesting time to think about all the things that we now do day to day in 2020 that in 2019 would have seemed completely implausible. So we kind of need to get into this position of kind of befriending uncertainty and being ready for uncertainty, and not kind of, you know, once this crisis is over, relaxing back and going, oh, we know what's going to happen now. Actually, we need to be in a position where we realise that, you know, with climate change, with, you know, the kind of global migration that climate change is going to drive, you know, we are going to face repeated crises of all kinds of different types, and we need to be much more kind of resilient and prepared for that. And the way to do that is through being better connected, I think.
Great, thanks, Viv. Now, I suggested that you might want to peruse the questions and see if there was a question that really resonated with you.
There were some questions about practical tools. I can't find them now, but, you know, what how do you actually do this, and what we found, and I would say I really wanted to echo that thing about partnering with local organisations. So looking for ways of actually, so for all the work that when I'm talking about communities, I actually mean partnering with existing organisations, not trying to find individual residents or individual citizens, because that's quite hard, but with organisations that trust. And I think in that way, one of the tools that Emily, that I learned from working at the Young Foundation was the power of community-led research. And so this idea of actually finding ways of equipping and resourcing local people that live in that place and have this lived reality, equipping them to be partners. So not necessarily doing the whole thing, and they don't have to always be academic, but actually bringing them in ways. And one of the things that I found in the current work that we're doing is that in South London, there's a whole bunch of people who have left academia, Black people of colour, who have left academia because they have been frustrated and angry, and, you know, or were never allowed in or whatever, who are desperate to engage in this kind of work. There's all this talent there, which is currently kind of swilling around. So I think that finding ways of, you know, using tools of community research and that kind of thing, and engaging in conversations, finding methods and tools that mean that the work requires is designed that we have to have conversations with people outside of our institutions.
Great, and thank you for picking up on the call out for practical tools and how we can make this into our lives. Viv, I wonder if you could reflect on the role of public engagement professionals. I think Vari asked a question about, you know, what is our role within this, and what can we do to enable others to adopt these kinds of practices, and you know, what are the tools we need to enable that to happen? Is that
That's a completely fair question. I can definitely respond to that. I think there's two ways of looking at tools in this respect. So one of the things that myself and colleagues have found is, in terms of tools we can use to do actually what we've been trying to do for many, many years as public engagement professionals, we found that actually responsible innovation as a framework, as introduced by EPSRC, has opened up a space wherein we can help researchers make sense of what engagement is for. And so that is a tool that is available and open, and it gives a really clear kind of connection between this is why you engage and this is what it can do, and this is how it builds towards excellent research and research that we as a funder value. So there was a comment in the Q&A as well about how other research councils need to follow suit, and I really would support that, because I think, you know, we've been, as public engagement professionals, we've been pushing for a long time to integrate engaged research. You know, I've been talking about culture change for a long time, and part of it has been about struggling to communicate why, and this gives a really easy why. So I think that's a kind of a tool there. Yeah, and then I think it's the other side of it is thinking about what I was talking about before in terms of kind of innovating new tools. It's about looking at what we've got. And I guess one of the things I've started to kind of reflect upon as I've kind of made this move from public engagement professional into a kind of more academic role is one of the reasons I wanted to do that was because I kept getting my work written about by other people and them getting it wrong. And there's a fair amount of that in terms of there's amazing work that engagement practitioners do. We don't write about it ourselves. And actually, when it's written about by others who aren't doing the work, they don't necessarily represent it in a way that's actually faithful or communicates what's important about, you know, not just what was done, but crucially what it took to get it done. And so I kind of feel like there needs to be something around us kind of coming together and sharing the tools that we're using and reflecting critically on why we're using them and what they do. And I kind of feel like that's, I don't know if that's a tool, but that's something that we need to be a bit hotter on, I feel, at the moment.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Viv, as you might imagine, in terms of writing about what we do. And it's also an academic currency, writing. So actually being able to write in places where academics also participate. So it goes back to the engagement of academics within this work, as well as the engagement of communities. Okay, Jane, I'm coming to you. If you could make your response brief, not because I'm not managing the time, not because of any fault of the panel.
The one I was interested in is one from Shawnee, where the question was around, is it arrogant of universities to assume that they're needed? So a lot of communities may not feel the need for support. So I mean, very easy answer to this one. Yes, it is arrogant to go in with that assumption. And I know it's not intended in that way, but actually that certainly, I would agree, it's the wrong sort of mindset. One of the points I'd make on this, and I think it was something that I found in the very early stages of doing my role, is just stepping back. If you are going to work with a specific community, it's actually just stepping back and thinking, I guess, what relationship do they have to you? Why are you relevant to them in any way? And one of the things we decided very early on was actually that we would work with those communities where we had some sort of impact, or we had a footprint, hence my mention of working with our neighbouring community. And that relationship needs to develop over time. So I can quite honestly say it started in a very reactive, very practical way, that they wanted to talk to us about things like student accommodation and traffic. But actually that evolves over time, because you build that relationship. So one message is stand back and ask yourself why you're relevant, and why any sort of relationship is would feel like it was worth starting. And it may or not always start from a positive place. So it's not about being a sort of on a white charger and supporting and solving the world. And then the other one is, I would go back to my point of, if other people have the more relevant relationships, work with them.
Great, thanks, Jane.
Yeah.
And over to you, Emily.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on a really brilliant question from Hannah King, who has asked, so not everyone has the same vision for a future which prioritises inclusion, openness and diversity. So how do we bring along people that agree but don't see these things as a priority? I think this is a brilliant question. I think, again, I wouldn't want to say I have the answer to all of it, but I think there's a very interesting angle here in terms of what I increasingly call the kind of responsibility paradigms that are at work, which quite often in the community sector, we assume, because we believe in community ownership and we believe in community action, and that we know that communities know what's important to them, we then sometimes fall into the mistake of being too positivist about sort of what else they need in terms of being able to take part in these conversations. And we also fall into, a space, because we believe in diversity and inclusion, of not appealing to people on the grounds of common experience. And I think I really want to highlight the importance of lived experience in terms of what it can tell you. And this can be achieved through community research, peer-to-peer research, through sensitive ethnographic social science methods. It can tell you so much about what people do share in common, and therefore what the entry points to these harder conversations about how we become a more equal society are. And an interesting one recently is that we've been doing a project which is focused on safety. And at the same time, we've been doing a project focused on hardship. And those are the only two words we've taken into those conversations because they were the words that communities told us were most important. So we listened to the language we should start the conversation from. And from that, naturally, there's huge amounts of intersectional inequality and there's huge amounts of discriminatory structures that are affecting both of the experiences of those topics. But for the community, of course, it has thrown up huge amounts of conflict, but it has also thrown up language in common, a sense of, you know, the hardship in people's lives and that everybody experiences this. So I think we have to effectively take ourselves to a language that is recognised by communities, and we don't set that terminology. We actually go to them and find what the entry points to these conversations are, because otherwise we do fall into the risk of elite language, expert language, and therefore, you know, are we kind of stemming the conversation before it's even started? Thank you, Sophie.
Great, no, thanks, Emily. And I'm coming to you last but not least, Richard.
Okay, thank you. So I'm probably going to follow on from Hannah's question, but I also want to have a go at Andrea's question, which was asked at 10:52, if you would like to have a look at it, where it is, in which it's asked about the emergence of a public discourse in the wake of this crisis and what, you know, we can do as universities to shape that. I think that's a great question. And it also kind of goes to why I think engagement is so important right now. We've just had a vaccine authorized by the regulator, which is just an incredible achievement. And let's face it, an incredible scientific achievement to have reduced 10 years to 10 months to produce a working vaccine. We're all just incredibly thankful for that. And what's happened is, you know, science has come to the rescue. And we saw that before in post-World War II, when Vannevar Bush wrote about science and the endless frontier, and not taking any of that incredible achievement and human ingenuity away from it. I think what we probably need to be just a little bit wary of here is a discourse of scientific triumphalism over the next 5 to 10 years, in which engagement is kind of perhaps seen as a temporary prosthetic. And I think it's so important that we both celebrate those successes, but build humility in the face of success. And we have a role to do that in our communities, and also to ensure that we don't succumb easily to the lure of the technofix as being something that can solve all the problems in society, because technology can't solve all our problems in society. And I think it's just such an incredibly and wonderful opportunity for as Emily says, new methods, new ways of doing this now. And as Viv says about new ways of innovating ourselves to try to build more institutional reflexivity and humility. And I look forward to that happening.
And I just jump in on that, Richard. I think that whole point about the vaccine is so, you know, it's such an extraordinary thing, but it's landing in such different ways depending on who you are and what you're in and all that is. And so like the role of that we have in terms of our relationships with organizations and the way we temper how this message is going to go out is going to really impact. I mean, it's in all our interests that everybody participates in the opportunity of a vaccine, but we know that lots of people, particularly people who have experiences of distrusting the system for all their life experiences, you know, like, and it really matters. So this is the point at which this kind of work, you know, the rubber hits the road, guys. You know, this really matters, how this is communicated, and the engagement muscle that we've already developed, you know, stating the obvious.
It's not stating the obvious, and I think it's a brilliant way to finish, you know, that idea of, you know, like that actually this is really important. And I love the idea of that engagement muscle, and how do we actually use that muscle to contribute and to listen and learn from others. But thank you very much for your time, for your provocations. Thank you particularly for those of you who have come into the conference from outside of higher education. It really does sharpen our practice and our thinking. So thank you for that.